Welcome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this water cooler chat. This is going to be an episode of the Applying 4DE in the Classroom series. My name is Joey Moreno. I'm the Education Programs Assistant at ESA. Today, the presenters are going to be Justin, Zakiya, Erica, and Loren. And I can stop sharing my screen, and whenever you're ready, Justin, you can go ahead and start.
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and share my screen then. Okay, great. All right, so welcome to today's water cooler chat. And this is kind of coming out of a special working group uh, for 4DEE dedicated to non-majors. And this working group has been discussing various things about teaching ecology. And one thing that's come up a lot is what's the difference between ecology and environmental science? And we wanted to have a discussion, not necessarily so much to convey ideas to you, but also to get ideas from you. And so what we're going to do today is have a relatively loose framework. I'll give a brief introduction to what 4DE is so that we're all on the same page. We'll then have a discussion and we'll just have a wrap up with insights and conclusions. So why don't we get going and consider 4DE in the context of both environmental science and ecology? And the key thing to note is that the framework was originally built around ecology. And I think the easiest way to think about this is through the concept of ecological literacy. What would we want an ecology student to be able to know and do by the time they completed a course or perhaps even a degree? And the framework that's been adopted by ESA about 6 years ago is divided into 22 elements in 4 dimensions. And so some of these may seem relatively familiar to you. The first one, core ecological concepts, if we consider ecology classes, it's kind of the classic organization of a textbook, right? Going from organisms to populations and to the biosphere. These are the basic foundational pieces of information and concepts that make up ecology. The other thing that many people are familiar with is ecological practices. And so ecological practices are those things we would expect an ecology student to be able to do. And some of these are very particular to ecology. For example, natural history and field work feel very much ecology rather than general biology. But a lot of these other things fall into generally scientific literacy as well, right? Regardless of what you're doing, we would expect a science student to be able to do those things. We also have cross-cutting themes, and one of the ways to think about this is in the context of vision and change, if you're familiar with that. If not, the idea here is that these are principles or foundational ideas that underlie a lot of the other things that we're doing. So, for example, if you're going to talk about organisms, it's really difficult to do so without talking about evolution. If you're going to talk about ecosystems, how can you do that without considering systems? And so where this comes into 4DEE is the idea of how explicitly these are covered in a given course, right? They're always going to be there. You can't avoid them, but the explicit coverage is what's important. And then lastly, we have human environment interactions. And these are those ways that humans interface with the environment. There's things like global warming in there, conservation, management, and even ethics. And so it's something that you might not see as much in an ecology textbook, but is certainly critical for an ecology student. And I think the easiest way to summarize all this is if we look at all 4 dimensions, if a student took a course or had a curriculum and they didn't get any one of these, would they be a fully scientifically literate or fully ecologically literate student? And so, for example, if you don't know the core ecological concepts, probably not. If you can't do the practices, probably not. If you can't use these deeper themes to understand these other areas, probably not. And lastly, if you don't know how all this applies to the real world, you're probably not ecologically literate. And so what we're thinking about today, this was written for ecology, but how does this apply to environmental science courses? And to do that, we have a series of questions, which we'll get to in a moment. But as we start working on these questions, Zakiya had a brief survey that she was hoping people could take. And Zakiya, I'll go to that slide and let you introduce that, and then we'll move on to our discussion.
Yeah, we wanted to do a survey to try to get a pulse on people's perspective, looking at comparing environmental science to ecology. So if you can scan this QR code or click on this link, It's about 5 questions, shouldn't take very long. If people wouldn't mind filling out that survey, and in a few minutes, I can kind of share a little bit of the results if we have time, Justin. And
Great.
yes, I can put the link in the chat.
Oh, okay, great. So, all right, let's go ahead and move on. And while we start the discussion, I'll get all my videos and stuff back. I don't know where all the screens went, but all right, so let's move on. So we have kind of 2 sets of questions, and here are our starting ones that we hope people can jump in on. And I think Joey's going to help kind of wrangle people commenting. We do have quite a few people here today, so I'm going to ask that you try to limit your comments to 30 to 60 seconds or something to that effect. And that's just so that everybody has a chance to speak who might want to, and nobody dominates the floor, as Joey mentioned at the beginning. And also, as we already mentioned, feel free to use the chat feature to communicate questions or ideas that you have. And Erica will really be looking at that to summarize it for us. So with that, I'll open the floor up with these starting questions.
It sounds like people are doing the survey, so thank you.
Oh, that's everybody's doing the survey. All right, why don't we give people a moment to work on the survey here, and then we'll dive into more of the discussion as soon as somebody's ready.
Justin, I'll
Yeah.
fill in with maybe just a bit of context for the starting questions.
Yeah, sure.
For people who are able to fill out a survey and listen at the same time. 4DE is a great starting point to think about how to organize courses, but perhaps the starting premise here is thinking about your own teaching and how you might approach teaching an ecology course differently from an environmental science course, wherever you might be in your particular context. And certainly there's going to be a lot of overlap. What degree is there overlap in your mind? Might be some of the starting comments to just get things rolling based on your personal experiences.
I could get started. Bob Hagan. First of all, I teach field classes, so I'm out there doing stuff. So in some ways, the content is not the primary focus of what we're doing. We're doing things and hoping that the content kind of is coming from other sources. But in comparing the lab that I teach, which is in the environmental studies program, with a similar lab that accompanies the Principles of Ecology lecture, it really comes down to priorities in terms of what you're going to spend time on. Probably the clearest example is when we visit streams. In the ecology class, the lab there will often focuses on a comparison of different stream macrohabitats, riffles versus pools in terms of their particular invertebrate communities. Whereas when I'm taking environmental studies students out, our focus is on assessment of stream health. What do those invertebrates tell us about the relative health of this stream? And functionally a lot of overlap, but the focus is on the applied question. It's not that I'm uninterested in the other question, it's that we got a limited amount of time, and that's what we're focusing on. So I think that's kind of at least my take on how these are different. It's what you can fit into a class.
Yeah, that sounds like a big difference in the dimension of ecological practices, right? You're talking about very different practices that might go on in the field between those two. We have Gene Woods.
Yeah, hi. So I teach both of these courses, but for me, the challenge is that environmental science is a 100 level distribution course. And so their ability to, absorb some of the more complex ecological concepts is pretty limited. But I would say that in environmental science, I focus quite a lot on human responsibility, human impact, that sort of thing. I do try to, because it's one of the goals of the course, we do focus on the practice of science and how we would do science, to give them that understanding, to be able to go out and as an adult and understand what's going on. And then ecology, I tend to teach that more traditionally with actually fairly little human interaction stuff. So that's, this is why I'm interested in this, is to see sort of what other people are doing.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So kind of the idea that there's that majors versus non-majors is part of the difference sometimes too. Environmental science classes have really, over the past 10 years, become a really common non-majors option alongside things like bio, chem, physics, geology, and things like that. And so, yeah, I think we more often find ecology classes as that majors flavor, and these environmental science classes are often these distribution requirements in many cases, although there's still major ones too. Other thoughts on this question set? We've got Loren.
Yeah, hi. I think since I learned about 4DE, it's really muddied my differentiation between the two because like when I was an undergrad, I felt like ecology was just the practices and the concepts, and the human element was really left out. And that was like saved for the environmental science classes. Whereas, and then after doing a master's in toxicology, which I feel is a highly environmental interdisciplinary field, and then going back to an ecology side for my PhD, I think I always think about them way more as intertwined than I ever did. And it was so cool to find this framework that was kind of forcing people to think about like how can we teach that human environment interaction in ecology and not just from an environmental science standpoint. So for me, it's really hard to differentiate between the two because I think with humans and how they've interacted with the environment so much, it's hard to just teach ecology from like a concept standpoint. And you want students to think more applied and how humans are kind of affecting the environment.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So kind of this kind of idea that classic ecology classes didn't have that human environment interaction as being centered very much. And I think that's true if we look at textbooks and things and a lot of courses that was pushed to the side, or maybe it's left till the end of the semester when you're covering things like ecosystems and then you don't have time to get to it and so on. And so yeah, and the framework kind of the idea is we want to cover all these things and not leave that out. Great. Other thoughts? I think Loren, you kind of had a diagram that kind of spoke to what Loren was just saying a moment ago. Do you want to discuss that for a moment?
Yeah, go ahead. I think
I'll go ahead
that's
and
in your
forward to
slide
that.
deck. Yep. That
Let's
might
see.
be a
There we go.
way to inspire some more conversation, to really delve more deeply into this. So as part of our non-majors working group, we've been thinking a lot about this and came up with this framework, perhaps, for a discussion starter. Not proposing that any of these are the best or right answer, and you can use the chat maybe to vote which of these aligns best with how you view the relationship between ecology and environmental science, particularly in the course context. Certainly there's overlap. Maybe A, is the overlap increasing and muddying the waters, as Loren suggested? And B, is ecology just a subset of a larger environmental science field, a C? Or should we maintain that ecology is the main discipline that encompasses all of environmental science, given that ecology is both the abiotic and biotic and the human? So variety of answers here. Oh, at least one for all of them, which is interesting. Yeah, one D there. So how would you defend your answer? What led you to your choice?
I guess as an ecologist who came into an environmental studies program, and I've become aware that environmental science involves the geologists in ways that I hadn't ever really expected. And so I think we have to become a little humbler. I guess over the years, I've come to recognize that ecology kind of sits there within that broader frame, along with our friends in geology and atmospheric sciences in some ways too. So I think that's how I view it, at least.
And then maybe others who chose A or B. What is the rationale and justification for maintaining them as very separate disciplines?
Carmen, you had some complex stuff in the chat. Do you want to share that with the audience via voice?
Yes, I think in my university, the how it was viewed, it was really a historical impact of biology had ecology, but no humans in the discussion. And environmental earth science department had all the climate change and all the physical stuff, but no discussion of living components. So they were very separate. And if you wanted to talk about the human impact within ecology, you were really crossing over to the other side, the other department. But today we have to. Everything is integrated today. So that becomes, so since people are hired by people who think a certain way and departments have a certain mission a certain way, you have to work on that and say, okay, what do we really differ in? All the geologists are in the environmental earth science, and all of biologists are in biology, and they have to talk to each other.
Mhm. Yeah, that reminds me of a kind of interesting phenomenon that ecology is pretty well defined, right? We kind of know what it is when we see it, whereas environmental science can be very broad. Like there's even environmental studies. And I think oftentimes we even see, and this was one of the questions we were going to get to later a little bit, kind of different flavors of environmental science. And this speaks to what you were saying, Carmen. Environmental science is sometimes housed in a biology department. Sometimes it's in a geology department. Sometimes it's even in a chemistry department. And I think that results in kind of two different flavors, one that's more biotic and one that's more abiotic. And I think for those of us at ESA, that biotic one is kind of a better fit. But I also don't think that means none of us are teaching that abiotic version or including abiotic things in the environmental science that we teach. But it's certainly, there's a kind of a division often based on where the course is taught out of. Has anybody experienced any sorts of implications with that where you're teaching environmental science in a different context in some ways?
Well, once you bring in environmental studies, that's another department getting involved and saying, we're the political scientists, we're the sociologists, we do environmental studies, and we throw in some science, but it's really about the people and that component. So again, it's all historical in some universities. In other universities, we're starting from scratch. You can actually do a better, more equitable integration of the elements within the issues that we're dealing with, in today's world.
Yeah, definitely. I think environmental studies, the terms environmental studies and science are really weird. I think what you're talking about is generally true, Carmen, that you do tend to get into more of that social side when it's studies, but sometimes that's even humanities. And one thing I found is looking around a lot as well is this idea that oftentimes the names become almost meaningless. There are some environmental studies programs that are really a lot like environmental science, and some environmental science programs where people choose their own path through it that look a lot like environmental studies. And so I really almost think that some of that comes down, you really have to look at the program and sometimes even an individual student to see what they're really getting, what their degree really is in. So.
And the faculty define what is in their program. The students sometimes clamor for more integration. And then in response to student demand and recruitment of students, you may do more melding in what's considered as more attractive to the incoming students for that university. So again, the university history and the university population of students has some impact on how much integration there is. How much should there be? If we're focusing on environmental problem solving as much as possible.
I see a lot of stuff coming in the chat there. Anybody who's typing in the chat, feel free to share your thoughts in the discussion as well here.
Yeah. And maybe a question to generate some of that response so that we can learn more from each other about our experiences and trying to separate them or merge them. What specifically is it that separates the disciplines? What would be basic ecology that is not environmental science, as an example? Or is there environmental science that is not ecology? Have people thought about those details as you're developing your courses, or in relation to your departments? That seems to be a theme coming up a lot here. How do we see ourselves in relation to our colleagues?
John Quinn here from Furman University. I think our space is kind of odd in that our environmental science is with 100% within the geology department. And so there's not this integration with ecology. And there's no coordination between the two. And so it's an interesting that they're all the applied. They might talk about some ecology, but they're also talking about planetary boundaries and water quality and all sorts of different factors. So it's almost like different starting framework. I put in the comment for, about the basic and applied. And Loren, I appreciate the enthusiasm for it. I think there's just so much cool science that sometimes it's fun to be able to do as compared to like solving problems, which is, that's what I'm passionate about, but sometimes I get just excited about the cool discovery that has no real world application and want to support the joy in that. And I think it also protects the advocacy side a little bit. If you can say, this is just science that was being done for the nature of science, and then building on it.
Yeah. A quick note, Zakiya in the chat mentioned she would still love it if a few more people would respond to the survey. The survey link is in the chat there. So yeah, and John, I think what you're speaking to is kind of finding that balance between the four dimensions, right? Like you're saying, we can't miss out on this really cool scientific things at the expense of only covering the problem solving and that human dimension there. Robert has had his hand up for a little bit. Oh.
I think one of the issues, and we've touched on it in the chat and conversations, is who are the audience and what's the level of the class? And I mentioned the chat, I'm teaching an interdisciplinary environmental studies program. So the students I'm encountering include everyone from basically, they could be majoring in the ecology and organismal biology, but they happen to be environmental studies, to at the other end, students heading for law school or social science programs or humanities. So what you have to think of is who are you addressing? A lot of ecology, the ecology course here is in the biology program and has prerequisites of a lot more of the biology programs, and we've actually had to create an ecology light version to get some of the ecological principles across to our students who are not doing the science track. And so I think it really is a matter of, okay, what can you fit into a semester? It really comes down to it, and where are you prioritizing? And I think with the earlier comments about traditionally in the ecology course, all this human stuff was tacked at the end and usually fell off the end of the semester. And if you kind of push it towards the front, or as the 4DE thing, integrate that within, the differences are not so profound. But I do think at the same time that environmental science has to touch on a much broader range of things, and because of that, you're having to shorten the amount of ecology because you're also getting in hydrology elements that wouldn't fit in a majors ecology course. So, yeah, different flavors and always hard choices.
And Robert, that's a really interesting point, because we talk about that a lot in our working group, making those hard decisions and prioritizing the, a little bit of chocolate in your peanut butter, a little peanut butter in your chocolate kind of approach. How much of the human dimension fits in ecology? And you're spot on. Like, that's a dialogue we had for quite some time, is so many of us being sort of trained as traditional ecologists. The HEI parts do kind of become the, if you can squeeze it in, go for it at the end. And similarly, perhaps, to where ecology fits within the framework of such a broad course as an environmental science course typically is and can be. So, I think from a practical perspective, that's probably among the more like bigger challenges we have, whether that's guided by history, like Carmen mentioned, textbook choices, like James mentioned earlier, just kind of how that all, you know, kind of maps for that 16-week semester that we're all kind of squoze into. So thank you for that.
And Zakiya, you had hand up.
I was just gonna pop in and agree. I don't know if it's Kaylee or Kylie. Our university is similar in that our environmental science department is separate from our applied ecology department. And I never understood necessarily why, but I do think depending on how your university is set up, that might feed into in your brain some of that separation. We do overlap as far as research topics and things of that nature. But again, just reiterating, yes, we are a very separate, distinct department, actually in two different colleges. So
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense that given that that's the departments that I see, it's like that's the distinction I'm making in my mind. But not to say that that's the only distinction that can be made, but yeah, ours is kind of separated in that way. So interesting to hear it's like similar at your university.
I'll pick up with a comment that Christopher just made about humans being an organism and therefore part of ecology, because I think sometimes we struggle with that. But disciplines like urban ecology, which is part of my background and I'm teaching right now, really call that separation into a severe question, I guess. Given that basic ecology can be done in urbanized environments, you can't ignore the humans though. But then of course there's environmental science application questions that come out of all that research. So I think the discipline of ecology is merging or has morphed much more into the broader unifying discipline today than it used to be, as far as it is in relation to humans as a species. But then that raises the question, the kind of that we're grappling with, is ecology and environmental science the same thing then? Or do we still want to maintain these distinctions for disciplinary sake anyway?
And kind of tagging on for Christopher's comment here, you mentioned, Christopher, environmental science is a much more attractive term to your students than ecology is in your part of the world. Would you mind either commenting on that in the chat or maybe commenting here live? I'm just kind of intrigued by that statement and your kind of perspective.
Sure. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. We recently added environmental science to our university. Used to be a geology or a geography program, and then they switched over to environmental science. We have other disciplines that are ecology related. We have an ecology emphasis in the biology department. And what we've noticed is that there's been a shift of students to the environmental science program, not necessarily because of the discipline they're interested in, but because environmental science is so much more attractive to them as not knowing what's out there, right? So they hear the term ecology or they hear the term environmental science, and environmental science is just so much more catchy. It ties to them, I think, more as a generation, as a younger generation than ecology does. And so we get environmental science majors that are saying, well, I'm really interested in fish or studying deer, when they really should be zoology majors, but they're not. They're coming in as environmental science majors, right? And so that's kind of what we're noticing here, is that it's really great for bringing students in, but sometimes they're headed off in maybe the wrong direction.
yeah, I think we experienced that at NC State as well, because we allow students to have a focal area. And so oftentimes students will take a zoology or ecology course and they'll say, oh my goodness, I want to take more of those. And it's like, actually, you probably should have majored in applied ecology. But I think you're right. There's something, I don't know, sexy or attractive about being an environmental science major. No offense to ecology majors, but I just wonder if there's some of that happens.
Yeah. So one thing that we've kind of been coalescing around here is this idea of the similarities and differences between in ecology and environmental science. And one thing we've heard a lot of people talking about is kind of the importance of human environment interactions in ecology that were sometimes left off historically. And perhaps there's also kind of the converse being true in that, you know, how much of ecology, of those core ecological concepts, should be in an environmental science class. So are either of these valuable without the other? And so we've got a kind of a second set of questions here. How much of core ecological concepts should be in an environmental science course? How much human environment interactions should ecology courses include? And with such inclusion, how similar are these two courses becoming? If we're really trying to make those ecological literate or environmental science literate students. So I'll throw that out there to folks.
And maybe to be a bit more provocative to spark some conversation. For example, probably a lot of environmental science courses do not go into much depth about ecology. It's kind of just a quick throwaway lesson, you know, one chapter in the environmental science book. Should there be more? What more might that be? And in ecology courses, one of the things our non-majors working group argued is that HEI is often left to the very end. Maybe one day on conservation biology at the end of the semester. Is that really enough, or should it be woven all the way through, and how much?
I'll maybe add, I think a challenge of this is how it fits in a curriculum. Having taught conservation biology and ecology and agroecology to a cohort of students, finding what they've already covered and what's a new advancement becomes really tricky. And so when we start talking about these courses melding or merging or overlapping, how do we go back and differentiate course A from course B is something I wrestle with personally, that I think if we allow conservation to become more important in ecology, what happens to a conservation biology class?
I'm reading through some comments here.
And in the meantime, Robert has his hand up.
He gave this reminded of time a number of years ago when I taught the introductory biology course. And what I came to realize that education was really a spiral. And in that course, we were sort of circling through all of the, you know, areas of biology with very much the idea that as the students continued in that program, they would be covering the same materials, but getting in depth, increasing their understanding of that. And I think in some of the same way with environmental science, what's attractive to students at the beginning is the applied element. It connects to things that they understand or think about or care about. But as they get further in, they begin to, if they continue in the sort of the science path, become interested in much more of the detail. And that's where a lot of the advanced ecology stuff. I keep thinking, coming back in my mind to optimal foraging theory, because it was a live hot topic back when I was an undergraduate decades ago. And it's there's a lot of wonderful theories and wonderful labs you can do with it. It doesn't make any sense in an environmental studies class because it presupposes it, but it helps us understand how animals make choices and decisions. And so it's part of that later circles of the spiral, if you like. And that may be one way to think about it, is the context in which the class you're focusing on fits in the education of the students.
What one person says, well, why are we trying to make a one-size-fits-all approach? You can't teach everything in any one course or even a degree. Does anybody have any thoughts on that, kind of the idea that maybe we shouldn't be strongly engaging in this?
Yes, Justin, I was actually typing in a reply to that point. I agree that we can't teach everything in any one course or even a degree, right? This is lifelong learning. And one size fits all, I don't think is a goal here. I think certainly the key point is to discuss so we can learn from each other what different combinations there may be and what flavors of emphasis may be more suitable for different contexts.
So Lauren's comment from the chat too about working at a smaller institution with limited opportunities for students to take courses in ecology. There's a general ecology course that is taught. And once again, the eternal conflict of trying to figure out how many different topics to fit into a course when you know that's probably the last course the students are going to have, or the first and last course the students are going to have in terms of exposure to content.
Yeah. Erica, do you want to speak to that in terms of kind of some of the things the non-majors group talked about?
Yeah, in terms of like prioritizing.
Yeah, like we
Yeah.
kind of thought about
Yeah.
that from those, smaller school. Oftentimes you maybe don't have an ecology major, but you've got an environmental science class, which I know you teach for
Yeah.
its majors and non-majors, but ends up
Yeah.
being mostly non-majors. And we came up
Yeah.
with some kind of
Both of those things. Yeah.
ideas in that working group.
Yeah, so one of those, if we kind of think about the CEC for a second, we had discussed the viability of a more buffet approach, where if you're trying to work into your non-majors courses, the HEI side, so I'm thinking about ecology for a second, trying to work in the humans are here, humans are present, what are the implications, and all the things, like you can, start to kind of maybe imagine in your mind, you're talking about biomes, well, you can't really get too far down the road about biomes without really thinking about human implications and interactions, just as a small example. So you kind of start to flip that in your mind about thinking about those human environment interactions. Then when it comes to the list, I think that we've all kind of lived by, thinking about the hierarchy of ecology and the ecological concept side, let those kind of fill in as you go. So I mentioned that buffet approach, that the focus shouldn't be so much a runaway list of things that you feel like you have to cover. You just kind of let the driver be something different, and you focus, you kind of shift your attentions differently. I think that's what I'm trying to describe. So less of an emphasis on making sure you cover every single component of the CEC, and focusing more on the human environment interactions and kind of letting that be more of a guide. Is that kind of what you're having in mind, Justin, or is that a little?
Yeah. You
Okay.
kind of because it speaks a little bit to the making those choices that we're talking about, where you can't do everything everywhere all at once. And so how do you decide where you're going to land?
Yeah.
Exactly. Robert?
I was just at a talk yesterday and offered in the geology department. But it was about, the focus is on place-based education. The speaker was Steve Semple from Arizona State. And it really resonated home. If we're looking for sort of an organizing principle to guide the selection of topics, and focusing on, okay, we are here. What is here? And beginning to think about, okay, you're in Arizona, you've got desert, or here we're in tall grass prairie. What are the features of this landscape and environment that you can use as kind of hooks, in effect, to get the students interested and then drive in? So in that way, for example, here in the central part, Kansas, coastal things just aren't immediately relevant. So, focusing on what we have and using that as kind of I guess the one of the filters in terms of what to select. Particularly true for an introductory course. I think less so maybe, well, certainly less so at the advanced level.
Yeah. George?
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in on this last comment just for a second, because I think there's great advantage to place-based learning because it focuses on the environment in which the students live and deal. And so, for instance, at Howard University, we did a lot of ecological and environmental work in the neighborhoods surrounding the university. And so there was that really great urban component that you could play with, and it had an immediacy to the students' lives and a connection to what they did and where they lived. That's on one hand, but on the other hand, these are students, many of our students are going to come from locations outside the university, and many of them come from abroad. Many of them will end up working abroad over their lives, or full-time or part-time. And so I think it's, we need to think outside our immediate neighborhood as well. And to that end, there's a couple of aspects that I'd like you all to consider as you move forward in your careers. And one is when you pick a textbook that has examples from elsewhere, that includes coastal examples if you're working in the high prairie or live there, or includes marine stuff if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, or Tempe, Arizona, or includes tropical examples that the students can work through. And I really think that there's some great advantages now that we didn't have certainly when I was an undergraduate, and that is students can go online and there's material, there's data, there are examples, there are online labs that they can do to give them kind of not firsthand, but certainly a better connection with tropical regions, Arctic regions, marine regions than was available when I was an undergraduate student. And so while doing neighborhood and place-based education is really critically important, considering the connections of the world and the fact that our students are not likely to remain in the neighborhood for their entire lives, it's really implicit that that we educate them to the larger world and greater opportunities and larger communities. Thanks.
Yeah. So George, I think what's interesting about what you and Robert are talking about is those are two concepts that really feel like they apply to both environmental science and ecology, right? Like both, regardless of which of those audiences you have, those ideas apply. And so we've been talking a lot about the differences, but what do people think makes ecology and environmental science similar? Does anybody have any things that really stand out to you? So the first one that came up for me was that we were talking about today was this idea that the basics of science are the same between them. And that was based on some of the things that Robert said. You know, you still need to know how to read a graph. You need to know the scientific method. What you do in the field and what you study might differ, but that foundation is similar. So there are other similarities that we can identify between these two disciplines. Interactions. So Gene Wood said interactions. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I just think that a lot of the ecology core concepts are about interactions between animals and the environment, or plants. I'm biased towards animals. And then environmental science, it's a little bit more, you know, the human dimension of interactions, but that they're all interactions.
Mm-hmm. And John Quinn, you said systems thinking. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
I think they're both focused on looking at interconnections and how do those feedbacks and time lags and all the effects affect each other. So there's I guess a background that's similar for both of them.
And then I think Zakiya, you kind of aggregated some of our survey results already, like immediately. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I just added a couple slides. I don't know if they'll pop up or not, but
Yeah, I can pull them up over here.
Oh, it's in a different version. Sorry about that.
Oh.
And I literally just screenshot it. If you go to the first one.
There
So
we
it
go.
looks like most of us are teaching both, which I was kind of surprised by. I thought it was one or the other. But it looks like most people are teaching both environmental science and ecology. When looking at how people view themselves, I think most people suggested they saw themselves as an ecologist, but then there was 14% that didn't identify as either. So I appreciate you all joining us and giving your feedback. And then on the next slide, I think we asked about membership. So it looks like most people are members of ESA. When asking about the welcoming environment, people were like, I'm not sure. And I'm not surprised by that. And then the next slide, I think a lot of this has already come up. But some of the feedback was that they didn't see it as less similar. What was interesting is someone suggested that the level of course varies, 100 versus 400. And I'm assuming environmental science 100 and ecology 400. And so I like this one. Ecology equals nature. Environmental science equals nature plus humans. And I think that's how most of us think about it. And then this last one, I would see them as overlapping where they can inform each other, but different grounding. And seeing environmental science as interdisciplinary. And I think most of the comments talked about environmental science being more interdisciplinary than ecology. So.
And I think this slide is really interesting for results of both. Um, and because I know going to the ESA meetings that I feel like I talk to as many people who are teaching environmental science as ecology as I'm walking around the meeting. And oftentimes we as a society, we're talking about teaching 4DE in the context of ecology. But if we have so many members who are teaching environmental science as part of their profession, and maybe there needs to be more room to talk about environmental science education, and particularly environmental science education in the context of the society and 4DEE. And again, this is just kind of based on my conversations with people, but you go to a teaching a workshop or talk and you're sitting next to people, you're going to find somebody that's teaching environmental science for sure. And so I don't know, do people think that we need to maybe be more welcoming to environmental scientists? This second result here seems to imply that people are unsure if we're welcoming those environmental scientists or not, which is perhaps a problem, especially if you look at the mission and vision of ESA. I don't know if it can be accomplished without environmental scientists, largely because of the aspects that relate to having an impact on the world. George is saying it'd be also, yeah, George is saying it'd be useful to reach out to folks in non-bio departments. Yeah, like that other flavor of environmental science, that abiotic flavor. I think most of us in this room are probably mostly thinking about kind of the biotic flavor of environmental science.
Justin, let me just follow up.
Yeah.
And point out that a lot of those departments are the earliest environmental departments, the ones that were formed back in the 1960s, early 70s. And most of them formed in geology at that time. There's a whole history as to why. But given that, they have real roots that are very, very different. And I suspect have a very different approach to environmental sciences. And it'd be really nice to just cross over and see how they differ.
Yeah, definitely.
And Jeff mentioned in the chat too about that very thing, talking to AGU about their approach.
Be real good.
Yeah. So I think we're close to our end on time here. I thought we were going to have some profound insights and conclusions that would sum everything up, but I think we kind of did that as we went. I think we recognized some common themes, some similarities and differences between ecology and environmental science. I hope that we recognize that we can view both of these through the lens of 4DEE. And since I get to have the last word, I'll say it.
Justin, I want to say something before you have your last word then.
Okay.
I think one insight for me is that we are still grappling with the challenge of thinking of humans as part of these systems. And and any others, as we would consider any other species as part of an ecosystem. And that's because there's still this tendency to want to separate humans out from ecology. And that's how we define environmental science based on the humans.
Yeah.
I think there'd be a lot of pushback among our broader colleagues about whether that's a legitimate assumption or not. But it's certainly an interesting issue because it's been debated for so long and continues.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's along the lines of what one of my final points was going to be, is that to have a fully ecologically literate student, you're going to have those human environment interactions in there, because otherwise they're missing a huge piece of what it means to be an ecologist. And likewise, I think that other question that we had about, do environmental scientists need ecology? I think especially for that biotic version of environmental science, that ecology foundation to some extent is critical to understand how those human environment interactions that you might emphasize function and work from a scientific ecological perspective. And so I think my kind of hope is that we can view these disciplines as being similar, just with some different emphasis. In your environmental science, you're going to emphasize those human environment interactions more, but you're not going to forget about the other things. In an ecology class, you're going to emphasize the ecological concepts more, but you shouldn't forget about the other things as well. And so that's my kind of final thought for this. And with time, I think, Joey, you had some things to wrap up with.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin and everybody. What a great conversation. It made me like think about, because I my major was environmental and sustainability studies,
Ah.
which was a BA, and then the other was environmental science, which was a BS. And it's funny because I would take classes with people who did the BS degree, and then with ecology, because I kind of wanted to be an ecology major, but we didn't have an ecology major. So it's interesting to like hear the background of what faculty think about that. But thank you. Yeah. So just wanted to, I'm gonna stop sharing your screen, Justin, and share my
Okay.
screen. But basically, if you are interested in more water cooler chats, just go ahead and go to our website, the ESA Weekly Water Cooler. There are more F4DEE resources that can be found at esa.org/4DEE. We are publishing new resources almost like every couple of weeks by our 4DE education scholars. So feel free to check that out. And coming this fall, we are having another FMN. If you want to know more about that, you can go look at our website also. And it's going to be preparing students for environmental studies and biology majors. Applications should be opening maybe next week or mid-April. But yeah, those are my last thoughts.
Do you want to describe what an FMN is really quick for those who might not?
For sure, yeah. So how it's a short recap. An FMN, how ESA does it is we get a group of faculty, which is about 9 to 15 people, which is going to be held by a peer mentor. But basically, we have we sort of talk about the topic, and also at the end, there's a resource that you can publish from your time at the FMN. But they're just bi-weekly meetings of people coming together, faculty coming together and talking about the topic, and essentially making a product or a resource at the end that anybody can use for their teaching course.
Yeah. So the faculty mentoring networks have been a lot of fun. So if you're interested in 4DE, I know who's in here. Erica and I have hosted one. I've hosted one with George, who was here. And if you're interested in these sorts of things, it's a really great way to take a deep dive in, and also just to really get a grasp of these things, as well as improve teaching things and make teaching materials. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.